And then extinction. This is withholding a previously available reinforcing stimulus. So I was reinforcing you. Not you, we don't reinforce people, we reinforce their behavior. I was reinforcing a particular behavior, like cooperating in class, and that behavior was increasing. And then for whatever reason, I stopped reinforcing that cooperation in class, and now I'm seeing your cooperation in class starting to decrease, right? So withhold is the procedure, function is a decrease. So in the past, because we need a history to have extinction, when Sam swore at Mr. Jones reprimanded him. And over time, Sam swore more often at Mr. Jones. Remember that example? It was counterintuitive. It's not what he intended. So Mr. Jones uses extinction. He asks Sam a question. Sam swears at him. But Mr. Jones, he's no fool now. He's figured, well, I'm not going to reprimand you anymore, because when I reprimanded you, you were spitting at me. And so over time, swearing at me. Over time, Sam swears less and less often, and kind of less behavior analytically and just more, armchair analysis here. Well, what happened here? Well, you could infer that Sam was liking the attention he was getting from the reprimand, right? Looking like a bad guy in class, and his friends were watching him get reprimanded. Maybe they joked about it. And now when he no longer gets the reprimand, he's lost that attention, and it's no longer cool, and so there's no payoff in it anymore, and so he stops doing it, right? Think of extinction that way. There was a payoff for what I was doing, but the payoff isn't there anymore. I'm going to stop doing it. So he swears less and less often. So you have, what was the consequence? There wasn't an add or a subtract. It was simply withholding a previously delivered consequence. And behavior decreases, you have extinction. Oh, the swearing angel. I have to tell this story. I was visiting a school a couple years ago. I was asked to come in and consult with their special education classroom, all students with autism. And as I'm walking through the classroom, there's this very attractive little blonde boy. He literally looked like a picture of an angel. So cute. And he's walking by and smiling at me. And as he comes past me, he just lets loose with the most truly impressive stream of profanity that I've ever heard. I couldn't possibly do him justice by trying to imitate and tell you what he said, nor would I want to. But it was truly remarkable that these words came out of this little angel's mouth. And of course, being the naive person new to the classroom, I stopped thinking like, what the heck is going on? Should I be stopping him? And I see the classroom teacher looking at me going, don't say anything. I'm like, okay. So I just ignore him and I walk over and she pulls me aside and she said, really interesting story with this kid. Yeah, please tell me. So we're his fourth school this year. He's been kicked out of 4 schools. We're the end of the line. He needs to stay here. Well, what's been happening is that he would use this extreme profanity, and he was very young, like kindergarten, grade 1. And if you say these things in kindergarten or grade 1, you really can't do that in Disneyland, right? It's completely inappropriate. And so he would basically get kicked out of the class. It worked for him for escape and attention. If he didn't want to be somewhere, he'd just look at the teacher and they'd be like, you have to get out of here. And if he didn't want to do something, he'd do the similar thing. And so he'd been kicked out of 3 schools. And now he was in this special education class, and it was run by behavior analysts. And so they weren't going to fail him, right? They wanted to get a hold of this. And so they recognized that what was the consequence, part of the time, was he got all this remarkable attention if he swore. And so they came up with a strategy where no matter what he said, they would completely ignore it. They would look through him as though he had not said anything, which is easier said than done. And they had to actually set up a section of the school where he couldn't go outside of, because they couldn't have him near other kids who were risking he might say these things. And so for the first month, he was just swearing like a sailor nonstop, and he was very clever. He'd stop and say, excuse me, do you hear what I'm saying? Are you gonna let me say this at school? Right? Looking for some response, either the attention or the escape. And they just completely ignored him. And over time, they stopped feeding the problem behavior. It was eating attention, it was eating escape, and they didn't let it feed anymore because they could stand, in this case, the extinction procedure is planned ignoring. And they set up the environment so that they could actually ignore this otherwise pretty demonstrative behavior. And over time, it dropped off to the point where he now has full days. He's still kept in a special classroom. He doesn't go into regular education at that time anyway, where they can continue to implement extinction. Everyone is trained not to attend to the profanity, and he goes huge stretches of time without swearing. That's extinction. Now, they have to get him back into other populations, right? Their work isn't done, but this is the first step, and they haven't kicked him out of school, right? He's not off to his 5th school. So it's a step forward. Now, the lingering effect is, when new people come in, he identifies fresh meat, right? like, oh, there's this guy here. And so that's why he wanders past me and lets loose with this profane tirade, because he wants to see if I'm going to be a sucker. And I almost was, right, before I saw that. Don't attend to him. Right? So he stands out as the swearing angel. Effective use of extinction. But you're thinking, could you do that in your school? Do you have the facilities for it and the staff who could do it? Extinction is extremely difficult to do in a school setting, because if something's working for me in terms of problem behavior and you're no longer going to attend to it, you've just set the stage for behavioral variability. You've just challenged me to become more creative. Right? I'm going to come up with something worse, and then you're going to have to attend to that. Right? And that's one of the problems with extinction. It's one of the reasons, though, in textbook land, it's an elegant, simple solution. In the real world, schools are often really bad places to try extinction, because you can't tolerate him trying any harder. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. In the past, when Anne played with Tom, Miss Kim would praise Anne. And over time, Anne played with Tom more often. Tom asks Anne to play. Anne plays with Tom. Miss Kim no longer praises, so over time, Anne plays with Tom less and less often. So what was the reinforcer for her playing with her friend Tom? Well, apparently it wasn't Tom. It wasn't interacting with Tom. She was doing it because the teacher praised her for it. Right? She was doing it because of external sources of reinforcement, not because it was automatically reinforcing her to play with Tom. And so as soon as the teacher no longer is delivering the reinforcers that kept up her social behavior, that's withheld, she stops playing with her friend, right? So the problem here is really the reinforcer wasn't appropriate. We were hoping that playing with Tom would become its own reinforcer, and it didn't. It continued to be maintained by the teacher attention, and then it drops out. So you could go back to this and just come up with a more clever reinforcer. Extinction. If you've heard of extinction, you've probably heard of extinction burst, right? An extinction burst is this idea that if something's been working, it's been feeding the behavior, and you identify what it is and you successfully withhold it, and you no longer feed the problem behavior, the appetite is still there, and so the student will will try harder, right? If I've been screaming and I get to go to class, but now you ignore the screaming, well, then I'll scream and rip papers. And if that doesn't get your goat, then I'll scream and rip papers and flip the desk. And if you can still ignore that, then I'll pick up the desk and throw it at somebody. And you probably can't ignore that. I win, right? And this extinction procedure won't work. And so that's what would happen if this is baseline here, and now you implement extinction. Let's say it's planned ignoring, which isn't the only way of doing extinction, by the way. The behavior starts to increase in severity, because essentially you've changed the rules on me, so I'm going to try harder. And what will happen is if you stick to your guns, if you're able to stick to your guns, and in schools it's really hard, even in homes it can be really hard, they'll try, and they'll reach a point and realize, okay, I'm expending a ton of mental and physical energy and emotion here trying to get what's been working. This isn't working for me, and they'll learn that because the consequence is no longer available, right? The reinforcer is no longer available, it's been withheld, and you'll see the behavior then reach a peak and then typically fall off pretty rapidly, showing that they've learned this doesn't work anymore. So there's a few problems that occur. One is a lot of settings can't tolerate it getting worse. And if it starts to get worse and you're trying to stick to your guns, but then you just have to give in, you have to remove the child or give attention, then what you've taught them is next time, don't bother with the lower level problem behaviors, go straight to those things that worked last time. You've actually shaped worse behavior. You've increased the severity of the behavior. If you try extinction and you fail, so be warned. If you cannot guarantee that you can control the variables to be successful with extinction, especially in a school, don't try it, because you'll probably make it worse. The other thing that happens is if people don't understand and anticipate this, when they see it getting worse, they go, this isn't working, we need to stop. And so they give up at the wrong time. They just needed to stick it out to the top of this extinction burst. So we kind of operate on the other thing that'll happen is when the behavior drops down, you see it 0, and then it pops up a little bit here in 0. You'll see this thing where there's kind of spontaneous recovery. It can work and things can be going well for a period of time, and then it can rear its head again. It's kind of like, oh, I remember that you changed the rules. I'm just going to try again. And if you continue to stick to your guns and the previous reinforcer is no longer forthcoming, it'll drop off again. So just because it goes down, if you can do it, doesn't mean it might not blip back up later on. Just a check, so to speak. The research actually shows that this phenomenon of extinction bursts, at least in the published research, happens less than we might think. It certainly doesn't happen all the time. So my rule of thumb for most people is assume that it will happen, be planful, plan that it will happen, just in case, so that you're ready to deal with it. And if you don't get an extinction burst, phew, good for you. That's so much the better, right? But plan for it just in case. Be prepared. I would never suggest that if, this happened in a classroom unless I'd fully explain this to the teacher, and the teacher's like, yeah, let's give it a go. I think we can do this. Or the teacher's scared off by it and goes, I'm really not comfortable trying this. Give me another option. So extinction bursts. Food for thought. Can you really control all forms of reinforcement? For example, if it's attention and it's been primarily maintained by the staff, well then if the staff aren't attending to it anymore, maybe the other kids will attend. And if you're in a high school, maybe it's appropriate that you can convince all the friends not to attend to a particular behavior. But if you're in an elementary school, particularly early elementary school, it's really hard to control the group behavior of grade 1s or grade 3s, right? You can say to them, if Sally screams, just act like she's not screaming, but it's really difficult for them to do it, and you really have a high risk that someone will inadvertently provide an inadvertent source of reinforcement. So if you cannot, first of all, you have to identify what it's feeding, and then you have to guarantee that you can control all sources of food, all sources of reinforcement, that they will not be allowed at all. If you can't, scratch this off your list of strategies and move on to something else. Can you tolerate it getting worse before it gets better? And think about safety, right? If the child's been throwing pencils, and that's going to be put on extinction, what else might he throw that you cannot ignore? So if you can't ignore it getting worse, that extinction burst, then probably don't do it in schools. I rarely use extinction in schools, and usually when I do, I've got really interesting stories to tell as a result of it. The other thing that's happened is I've been in a school consultation in an afternoon. It's 2 o'clock. I'm scheduled to be done at 3. Kiddo thinks he's going home at 3. The SEA thinks that she's going home at 3. And we implement extinction at 2 o'clock for something, and the student persists and persists, and we have to stick to our guns, and we're getting closer to 3 o'clock, and when the bell goes, we can't just now give in, right, because we've said no. And if the student is fighting that, we have to stick it out until he reaches that peak and comes back down. And so I've been in circumstances where I thought I'd be there from 1 till 3, but then we leave at 5 o'clock at night, and the parents been waiting outside because everyone understood that once we committed to this, we had to do it. And that was actually a mistake. We didn't plan to do that, right? I might have had to cancel the next appointment. So you have to be really thoughtful. Can you stick to your guns? Is it really going to work in this setting?